Great, thanks very much, Greg. And welcome to everyone listening in today. Thanks for tuning in. The work leading up to this webinar has had a bit of a long and sometimes painful gestation. I first conceived the idea for these tools back in about 2018, but it took us a while to get some funding, and it's also taken a while to build the tools because one of them in particular has been technologically quite tricky. So it's really great to be able to be here to launch these tools to you today. Before I kick off, I'd just like to acknowledge the team that have been involved in this project. So the project was funded by Meat and Livestock Australia, and it was actually managed by the NT Department of Industry, Tourism and Trade. And a lot of people have been involved in the management of the project and also the development of the tools. And just really wanted to acknowledge that it's been a big team effort to get to this point, and really wanted to acknowledge all these people on the screen for their inputs to Paddock Power. So before I go too much more into what the opportunities are around infrastructure development, I do want to highlight that a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is very focused on Northern Australia and the Northern Australian extensively managed pastoral properties. And that's because the need for these tools was really born out of a lot of discussions I had with producers in Northern Australia, and that's where I guess the biggest opportunity is for development in a lot of ways. But as I go through the presentation, I think that you'll see that even if you're on a smaller property or in pastoral country, there are features of these tools that are going to be relevant to you. And that's not only in Australia, but potentially even internationally. So we estimate that there's about 44 million hectares of productive pastoral land still available for development across Northern Australia. And if we were to bring that land into production, we estimate that that would deliver an additional gross margin of just over $800 million a year to the industry. We have a big problem with calf wastage in Northern Australia, and it's costing the industry more than $50 million every year. And paddock infrastructure is one of the issues implicated in high rates of calf wastage. So anything we can do to reduce this figure is going to be a positive thing. We do have areas of overgrazed country in the north. If we are able to spread our grazing, our stocking rates back down to more sustainable levels in those areas, there's a great opportunity for us to lift per head productivity in the northern herd. And similarly, if we can get those stocking rates back under control in those degraded areas, there's a huge opportunity to improve land condition, pasture productivity, and therefore carrying capacity. So what am I going to cover today? Well, of course, I'm going to tell you what Paddock Power actually is. I'm going to give you a bit more background as to why we developed these tools. There's going to be quite a lot of the webinar dedicated to showing you the features and functionality of the tools, including 2 video demonstrations of how the tools can be used. And as Greg mentioned, there's a couple of sections in the webinar where we're going to be ready to take questions. So I really encourage you to use that chat box function, put your questions in there, and we'll answer as many of those as we can. So Paddock Power is actually a package of 2 digital tools. We have a mapping tool, which has been designed for use in a software program called QGIS. And QGIS is a free mapping program that you can download from the internet. The investment calculator part of Paddock Power has been designed for use in Microsoft Excel. And both of these tools are supported by a very hands-on training workshop and a comprehensive step-by-step user manual. And I noticed in some of the registrations that there are quite a few people listening in today who have already attended one of the pilot training workshops, and we've had really good feedback about those so far. So it's a single-day workshop. And the user manual has been written in such a way that it's a step-by-step manual, so that once you've had some early tuition in the Paddock Power tools, you should be able to go home and follow your nose and use these tools under your own steam. The basic workflow that we use in Paddock Power is, firstly, you need to identify options for developing your paddock or your property. We then plan those options out using the mapping tool. And once we've done that, we take key data out of the mapping tool and your own records and knowledge, and we put those into the investment calculator to assess the financial merits of the development options that you're considering. So why do we develop these tools? Well, quite frankly, there's a lot of this going on in Northern Australia. We quite often have very large paddocks with a relatively small number of water points. And this can cause congregations of large mobs of cattle around those waters and can lead to pasture degradation close to water. And even in the same paddock, we can have areas beyond 5 kilometres from water that are virtually unutilised by livestock. So part of the reason for development in Northern Australia is to achieve a more even utilisation of the landscape, and the Paddock Power tools help to inform that development. So what are some of the practical impacts of poor paddock infrastructure? Well, as I showed you on the previous slide, we have areas of overutilised feed and underutilised feed, and this is primarily related to distance from water. We also can experience a mismatch between the energy demand of our livestock and the energy that's being supplied by the feed base at key times. And a good example of this in the north is that the energy demand of our breeders late in the dry season, when they're either heavily pregnant or lactating, is at its highest. But that's also at the same time when the quantity or the quality of the feed supply is typically at its lowest. We also see that a lot of energy can be wasted on walking, whether that be walking out from water to get to better feed or walking between water points. This has a direct impact on the live weight gain of our growing cattle, but also on the body condition of our breeders. And breeders in poor body condition often fail to reconceive, and we can have higher rates of calf mortality when our breeders have poor body condition because their milk supply isn't as good. But there's also some other sort of sinister and less obvious effects of infrastructure on rates of calf mortality. And producers tell us that anecdotally, they believe their rates of calf loss are higher in large paddocks that have a small number of water points. And if you can imagine a scenario where a breeder might give birth to her calf several kilometres from water, she then has to leave that newborn calf at some point, walk back into water, have a drink and walk back out again. And in the time that it takes to do that, various things can happen to that calf. So it may actually die, have dehydration because it hasn't been able to suckle. It may be predated upon by a dog, for example. And of course, we always have those breeders who are just bad mothers and they might wander off, have their drink, but then forget where they've put that calf and not be able to find it again. When we have too few paddocks on a property, it limits our opportunities to do some of the recommended practices such as controlled mating or herd segregation. If you have really large paddocks, they can be very time consuming and costly to muster. So it provides sometimes a disincentive to go and muster those to get the bulls back out again. And similarly, if you don't have enough paddocks, it's really hard to be able to segregate your breeder herd appropriately on pregnancy status. Not having enough paddocks also has an impact on being able to build country from grazing, whether that be through wet season spelling or rotational grazing to maintain or improve land condition. Some of our paddocks in the north carry hundreds and sometimes thousands of cattle in them. And if you have to remove all of those cattle from a paddock to achieve a spell, something needs to happen with those cattle. They either have to be sold or registered, or they have to be put into other paddocks on the property. And there's always a risk that you'll be overstocking other paddocks in order to spell others. And this can be counterproductive if you're trying to achieve land condition improvement. Finally, we can't always achieve clean musters in the north, especially in large, very scrubby paddocks. It can be quite difficult to get all the cattle back, and this has implications for herd control. So you can be buying the best bulls in the world and trying to improve your genetic potential of your herd, but if you can't get your bulls, your neighbours' bulls or the scrub bulls, that's really going to slow down the rate of genetic progress in your herd. So as a result of all of those challenges, there is a lot of development going on in Northern Australia. And that's been ramped up in the last 5 years in those areas that had good beans, and with cattle prices the way that they've been, there has been more money floating around for infrastructure development. So it's happening at great pace. But what Paddock Power provides is a way to take a more targeted approach to this allocation of capital. And this is important because I don't know of any producers that have a magic treasure chest of money to spend unlimited funds on infrastructure development. Quite a lot of development is still being done on gut feel, and that's certainly not to denigrate the experience and knowledge of producers, because that's a super important thing for where to put infrastructure. However, so many producers have told me that they're getting quite nervous about making what are sometimes decisions without the benefit of some harder data to back up what their plans are. Taking a more data-driven approach to investment in infrastructure can reduce business risk, and it can also identify really good bang for buck from options that you might be considering and help you to weed out those options that aren't going to be as good. And it doesn't matter whether it's infrastructure development or any other sort of investment, what we're always trying to achieve is to find that sweet spot that delivers us a satisfactory return in the shortest possible time without creating unmanageable risk to the business, particularly around cash flow risk. So what can you actually do with these magical Paddock Power tools? Well, most people, whether you're in a northern property or a large property or a small property, you can just keep your property maps up to date yourself. So rather than relying on a government agency or an NRM group or external provider, you can keep your own property maps up to date in real time. You can also put your own maps on your mobile devices, so your phone or your tablet, to them out into the paddock. And I know a lot of you are already using the Avenza Maps app, which is a really great tool. And a lot of you will have got maps from government agencies or NRM or groups or head office to put onto your phone. But the beauty about Paddock Power is that you can make whatever map you like for your property and put it on your mobile device. Its major purpose, though, is to plan and cost infrastructure development, whether that be paddock subdivisions, new waters, new fences and pipelines, before you build them. And one of my favourite sayings about Paddock Power is it gives you the opportunity to make your mistakes on the computer instead of out in the paddock. Paddock Power helps you to compare different development options to see which ones are going to give you that best bang for buck. But it can also help you to identify dud options that might look really good on paper or in your head, but when you actually crunch the numbers on them, they're no good. Paddock Power generates reports that you can give to owners, shareholders and banks to secure funding for your development plans. And once you've set up a project in Paddock Power, you can take it offline and use the tools offline without the internet. So how does Paddock Power assess financial merits? There's lots of different ways of doing this, but the approach that we've taken in Paddock Power is to use a basic 10-year discounted cash flow analysis approach. And the reason we've done this is because it marries up really well with the Business Edge workshop that's supported by Meat Livestock Australia. And if you want to know more about capital allocation theory and practice, as well as other business concepts related to livestock businesses, I really recommend Business Edge as a great workshop to attend. In order to do a discounted cash flow analysis, the first thing you need to do is to be able to document your costs. And these are not only the costs of the actual physical infrastructure that you're going to put in, but also the ongoing running costs of the property or the paddock that you're developing. You also need to be able to quantify in dollar terms the benefits that you expect to realise as a result of doing the development. And these can be things around improved carrying capacity, increased per head productivity, or perhaps even cost savings in running costs as a result of actually putting in the new infrastructure. Paddock Power also provides you with a set of sensitivity tables that help you to better assess risks and opportunities around the infrastructure that you're planning. So rather than just delivering a single number to you saying, yes, do this, or no, don't do that, we provide information about how your infrastructure development might perform with the assumptions you've made around herd size, productivity, and costs, but it also gives you other combinations of those things to see how it will perform if your assumptions weren't met. So for example, if you put in some development and then you run straight into quite a long drought, how would that perform if, say, your herd size was smaller and your per head productivity was lower than you anticipated? And conversely, if you ran into some really great seasons and you had a sustainably larger herd size and better per head productivity, how would the infrastructure development perform under that combination? So we're now going to play a video for you that shows you the features and functions of the mapping tool, including a worked example that we'll later on put into the investment calculator tool. So I'll hand over to you, Greg, to play that. When you first open up a Paddock Power project in QGIS, this is what you'll see. Down the left-hand side, we have a series of map layers, and these are a combination of layers that you import yourself from your own records, as well as layers that the Paddock Power tool derives. There's a Paddock Power ribbon with tools on it, and these help you to do things like import those map layers, and they also allow you to reanalyze the project periodically to update all the distances, areas, and carrying capacities after you've mapped infrastructure. Down the bottom here, we have a series of Paddock Power tabs which describe the paddocks, the infrastructure, and the land types on the property. And over on the far right-hand side, we have a series of sketching tools that allow you to sketch pipelines, fences, and water points. You can see here I've got a paddock open called Far Away, and it's a large paddock. It's 1,400 square kilometres in size. And you can see that there's 2 water points in it at the moment. There's a bore and a dam. And I can turn on the watered area layer to show the water circles around the dam. I'll just zoom in there a bit more. So this darker shading here is the 3 kilometre grazing circle, and the blue one is out to 5 kilometres, and everything that's shaded this white grey colour is unwatered. You'll notice that this water point over here, the bore, doesn't have any grazing circles mapped around it. And that's because a bore itself doesn't provide water to livestock. You need to actually put infrastructure at a bore for them to access water. If we look at the paddock tab down here, you can see that the watered area with that dam in it is currently 56 square kilometres. And given the land types that are within that watered area, the tool has calculated it could carry 84 adult equivalents for 365 days. If this property or paddock was fully watered and in A land condition, the tool has calculated that it can carry about 5,000 adult equivalents per year. You can see that I've put the satellite image behind the paddock that we've got in the project. And that's really helpful for when you're mapping new infrastructure, is to be able to see that. And I might just click off that watered area so you can see it more clearly. Another layer that's really helpful when you're adding new infrastructure is to look at the underlying land types. So if we toggle on the land type layer, you can see that I've colour-coded the land types based on their productivity. So anything that's red and orange has low productivity or low carrying capacity, and anything that's green or blue has high carrying capacity. And this is really helpful when you're mapping new waters, for example, to know where to put that infrastructure in relation to the productivity of the country. The owners of this parcel of land are considering 2 options to begin the development. The first of these is to put in a dam in the western part of the property. And they want to do that because they consider it to be a relatively cheap option, and they've identified a dam site. So we go down and across to the Sketch Water Point tool. The dam site is actually down here in the southwest corner. So we're going to place that dam there. Paddock Power does a little bit of work and then maps a new water point. You can see that this water point by default has been mapped as a trough, and you can see it down in the water point list below. We actually want to turn that into a dam. So we select this pencil icon. We can give that dam a name if we're at that point. We're going to call it Ned's. We're going to call it a dam. And you can see here that the grazing radius has been set at 3 kilometres and 5 kilometres. Paddock Power uses 3 and 5 kilometre grazing radiuses as the default, but you can use whatever numbers you like. So this is where you change that for your situation. Save that, and that will update our map with the dam. Now that we've mapped that dam, we can go back to the Paddock tab and see how the statistics have changed. So now the watered area of the paddock is 127 square kilometres, and that altogether the paddock can now carry 164 adult equivalents. And this information will be used in the investment calculator later on. One of the other things you can do is you can actually change the land condition of the land types in Paddock Power. And you do this by using this magnification tool in the paddock area. And it opens up 2 tabs over on the right-hand side. One of these shows the current scenario before this new water point was put in, and a future scenario, which is what the carrying capacity would look like if that new dam was built. We can resize these windows to get a better look. And you can see here all the land types are all in A land condition. And you can see here this desert land type is actually contributing quite a lot to the carrying capacity of the paddock, 60 adult equivalents for a year. If you didn't think it was realistic that these land types would stay in A land condition, you can change them by using the edit tool against the land type. So here a pop-up box appears and you can choose A, B, C or D land condition. And when you choose those, it applies discounts to the carrying capacity based on grazing land management science and theory. We won't worry about doing that here, but it's just to show you that that can be done. Second option the owners are considering is running a pipeline and a trough from the bore to their better country. So the way that we do this is we use the Sketch Pipeline tool. We're going to start at the bore and go up through this gap in the range and into this better country. And there's our pipeline there. If we look in the pipeline tab now, you can see it's here. The length of that pipeline is 14.5 kilometres. And a cool feature in Paddock Power for both pipelines and fences is that you can look at the terrain profile of that line. One thing to notice with this is that the scale is quite compressed. So if you look at the actual data, you can see the minimum elevation on this pipeline is 409 metres above sea level, and the maximum is 481. So there's only about 70 metres of elevation change over that 14.5 kilometre stretch. So this looks a lot more steep and stark than what it would be in real life. However, it's really handy to have this because it may help you to organise what sort of pump you might need to push water around the landscape, but also where to situate a tank if you wanted to gravity feed water from a tank to a trough. This distance of 14.48 kilometres, that's the actual distance taking the terrain into account. So this represents the minimum length of pipe that you would need to do this project. And that's a figure that will go into the Paddock Power tool later. Of course, we want to put a trough on the end of this pipeline. So we go down and we map a new water point. We're going to put that on the end of the pipeline. There it is there. And we're going to leave it as a trough because that's what we want. Might just turn this land type layer off so you can now see the watered area situation for the paddock a little bit more clearly. We now go back to our paddock tab. You can see that the watered area is now increased to about 200 square kilometres, and the number of cattle that can be run is 509 adult equivalents per year. This is a really large parcel of country, and logically the owners may wish to subdivide it into paddocks. Now you can make as many paddocks as you like, and that can be quite time consuming doing them all. So I'll just demonstrate to you a simple paddock split. To do this, we use the Sketch a Fence tool. And we're actually going to run this fence between the gap in the range and then down between these water points and through the southern boundary. And there is the fence that we're planning to build. And it appears in the Fences tab. And like the Pipeline tab, you can view its elevation profile, and you can also see the length of that fence, including the terrain. If we were happy with where that fence is going to go, we take it from a drafted status to a planned status. And this will update the two paddocks either side. So now you can see we have far away A and far away B on the map, and we can also see them in the paddock tab. Using the edit tool, you can change the names of these paddocks, and you can see now the area of each paddock, the watered area of each paddock, and how many cattle it could currently carry given the water infrastructure that you've planned. And you can also see that in this case, we've split these two into quite even carrying capacity. One of them is 2,400 and the other one's touch over 2,500. So that might be quite helpful if you're trying to do, say, a paddock rotation where you want to have equal carrying capacity between the two different paddocks. Shortly, we're going to put the data that we've created out of this mapping tool into the investment calculator. Yeah, very good. So now we're actually going to play the second video. So the second video is about how we're taking the data from the mapping tool that we just showed you and putting that through the discounted cash flow analysis. We made a purposeful decision to keep the mapping tool and the investment calculator separate. This is because some people may wish to use either of the tools independently, not necessarily both together. So the mapping tool has been built in QGIS, and the investment calculator is a tool that's used in Excel. And I've got it open here now. And the first tab you can see down the bottom here is the Start Here tab. And this contains some background to the calculator tool, some of the metrics that it uses, describes the different tabs that you can see here along the bottom, and instructions on how to enter data into each of the tabs. The first thing we do when using the calculator tool is to fill in the baseline situation. So this is what the current scenario is for your property or paddock that you're doing the infrastructure development in. One of the features that we've built into it is this drop-down menu, which allocates different regions of Northern Australia to the calculator. And when you choose one of these, it populates various fields throughout the calculator tool, including an adult equivalent conversion table and some benchmarks around costs and livestock performance. For the demonstration today, I'm just going to choose NT, VRD and Catherine. The name of this development is going to be Water Development in Faraway. The first thing we have to do is actually fill in what this paddock currently carries in terms of adult equivalents. And this information comes from the mapping tool and your own records. After that, you fill in a whole bunch of information about the infrastructure and carrying capacity of the paddock, and most of this comes from the mapping tool. Anywhere that you see white shading is data that you can fill in, and the grey shaded boxes are those that calculate automatically. So you can see there's actually not that many areas where you need to find data to populate the baseline tool. Further down from this, we have to put some information in about your beef production, and we measure that in kilograms of beef produced per adult equivalent carried. And there's a section here where you can put a number if you know this from your records, but if you don't know it, there are some regional benchmarks for the region that you've selected supplied to guide you, and you can use these, which is what I've done for this example. Similarly, the enterprise expense information, so these are your direct costs per adult equivalent. Again, you can get this from your own accounting records. If you don't have that information, the regional benchmarks from the Australian Beef Report are also supplied to guide you. And finally, we just need to put in some assumptions that will be used in the discounted cash flow analysis around the discount rate to adjust for inflation, as well as the long-term average value of a beast on your property and the long-term average price received. And that's all we need to do to set up the baseline. The next three tabs are identical to each other, and they represent three different options that you may wish to compare. Option 1 is the Southwest Dam that we mapped in the mapping tool, and I've already pre-populated many of the white squares in this section with data out of the tool itself. The other things that we have to put in here are our costs for the development. And for this example, we're going to say that this is going to be a fairly cheap dam. It's going to be $35,000 to build. And we're actually going to get the stock camp to build about 1/2 kilometre of fencing around this dam at a cost of $2,000 a kilometre for materials. We're not going to build any other infrastructure, but if you were building yards and the like, you can put that in here. We're going to keep the enterprise costs for the development the same as what we used in our baseline, but it is editable, so you can change this if you think that there would be a change to your enterprise costs as a result of the development. And finally, we're going to add in any extra overheads that might be specifically related to this new development. In our situation, we're going to say there's going to be an extra $1,000 a year for water pumping, an extra $1,200 a year for labour, and an extra $1,000 a year for repairs and maintenance. That's all that we really need to fill in for option 1. And when we scroll down through the sheet, this looks really complicated, but it just presents all the data of the 10-year discounted cash flow, which goes across the columns here, right through to year 10. And one of the things to really keep in mind when using the 10-year discounted cash flow tool is keep an eye on the size of the largest negative cash flow in the analysis and what year it occurs in. In this case, it's $103,000 in year 2, which is caused primarily by the investment in the infrastructure, but also the cost of retaining livestock to stock the new water point, or if you had to purchase those cattle in the market and you've foregone that revenue. You need to ask yourself, can your business cope with that level of cash flow deficit and that timing? And it's an important thing to keep an eye on. There are 4 metrics presented, and these are ones that are recommended as if you go along to the Business Edge workshop, for example. And you can see some benchmarks that are also recommended by Business Edge and Bush Agribusiness that you should try and meet if this is going to be a financially worthwhile investment. And the main one to look at really is whether the net present value is negative or positive. And what this indicates is that this investment of this, even though it's a cheap dam, it's actually never going to pay itself off by the time you take all the costs into account. And so this isn't looking like a very good investment at all. We also provide a set of sensitivity tables, which allows you to compare the proposed number of adult equivalents that would be realised by this development and their per head productivity, which you can see here. The 80 extra head at 71 kilos per AE is the scenario that you've looked at. But you can see that if your productivity was lower or your carrying capacity ended up being lower, then this even becomes even more dire in terms of an investment. And if we look at the other end of the scale, If we ran more animals and they had higher per head productivity, it's still a bit of a line ball investment. And you have to ask yourself whether these numbers over here are biologically plausible. Is it realistic that you could increase the carrying capacity or the number of cattle run over and above what is recommended for sustainable management, as well as increasing their per head production at the same time? And the answer is probably no. So by all accounts, even when we look at things like changing the setup cost of the water point, it doesn't make a significant improvement to the financial viability of this project. And we can see in terms of years to break even that we wouldn't achieve a break even point within 10 years. So we probably wouldn't pursue this option any further. Option 2, if you recall from our mapping exercise, was the new pipeline and trough. And here I've again added the data in from the mapping tool that relates to this development. The cost of the water infrastructure for this particular one, we're going to say, is $40,000 for the pipeline and trough. We're not going to be putting in any additional fencing, and we're not going to put in any additional yards or other infrastructure. We're going to leave our enterprise costs the same as they were. And similar to the last one, we're going to say there is $1,000 more overhead per year for water pumping and $1,200 in labour and mustering. And repairs and maintenance, given that we have a pipeline and a trough here, we're going to make $2,000 a year. Again, we look now down at the discounted cash flow analysis, and you can see the biggest deficit occurs in year 2, and it's $322,000. So you need to ask yourself if your business could manage that deficit. And when we look at the 4 metrics, you can see that they perform much better than the previous option, although they don't all meet the recommended benchmarks. But it still might be worth considering this option by tweaking a few of the assumptions. And to explore that some more, we refresh the sensitivity tables, and you can see with the additional 345 adult equivalents at 71 kilos per AE, we get this result in terms of net present value. But interestingly, if you reduced the stock numbers in this development and were able to increase their per head productivity as a result of that lighter stocking rate, you can get this scenario to work a lot better. And it's really worth considering something like that. You can also look at the setup costs per water, if it was cheaper or more expensive to develop than what you thought, and what impact that would have on the net present value after 10 years. And similarly, we get an indication of what combinations would result in a faster years to break even. And in this case, changing the cost of those water or that water point and pipeline wouldn't make a significant difference to the payback period. We then go down to the basic comparison tab, and it displays the results of both those scenarios side by side, so you can compare them at a glance. And it also throws up down here at the bottom which option is best based on net present value. And of course, infrastructure development isn't all about financial sensitivity. Sometimes you'll build infrastructure because it makes logistic or practical sense, and finance is not always the main criteria. But this tool actually does help you to weed out those options which really are not very sensible from a financial point of view. The final tab displays the results again side by side, but in a lot more detail. So it actually shows you the sensitivity tables side by side for the different options and compares them to regional benchmarks. And these can be printed out, stapled up, and provided as a report to owners, financiers, and shareholders. All right, so really to sum up, how can the Paddock Power tools help you? Well, they can help you to assess if your infrastructure plans might deliver benefits to improve live weight production, so more kilos leaving the property, opportunities to maintain or improve land condition and profit. And they can also help you to convey a stronger business case, not only to yourself, but also to owners and financiers for your development plans that you've got in mind. So where to from here? Well, if you want to increase your paddock power, if you're in the NT, probably the best port of call initially is your local NT department office, or else you can get in touch with me here at Range IQ. And these contact details here, just Google up Range IQ and that'll take you to my website and you can contact me via that. And if what you've heard and seen today sort of piqued your interest, I'd really encourage you to consider hosting a workshop in your region or getting in touch to get some one-on-one tuition and advice in using these new tools.